Hello again, everyone. Okay, so we're going to start talking this week. We're going to continue on with really big theoretical concepts. We're going to keep talking about theory as we move through really the frameworks for how we're going to understand the rest of the semester. I'm going to go ahead and get through some of these in our PowerPoint right now. I went ahead and did a PowerPoint this week so that you can see kind of the different options you have, right? I did a Prezi last week. This week I'll do a PowerPoint, and I'll kind of keep maybe switching back and forth to kind of give you different models for how we can see different presentations as we move forward through the class. But again, module 2 is going to be very theory dense. I am not going to expect you to have a full grasp or completely get every single thing, but there are some points that I want you to really understand, some terms we want to understand so that we can kind of have that guiding framework again as we're moving forward through these concepts when we talk about them maybe in the family or gender in the family or gender in work or things like this. As we're starting to build on those concepts, we need to kind of understand the framework for which we're operating. So we're going to start this week. Let's see. Oops, there we go. All right, we're going to start with the gender and intersectionality perspective, and mostly because I want to define some terms for you real quick and really give you the setup for kind of the rest of these pieces this week. Intersectionality really is a big theme this week, or these 2 weeks, I guess, this module. And so I kind of want to define some things. First of all, I want to define kind of identity. When we're talking about identities, we're talking about not just the things that society really depicts for us or really examines for us, things like race, where it is something that we can self-identify as, but it's also something that is imposed upon us by society's view of us as a human as we do this. And gender is sometimes the same way, right? So we have an identity that we absolutely subscribe to, a gender that we feel that we embody. But that gender might not be the one that's transposed upon us by society. And so we do want to make sure that when we're using the word identity, there are moments in time where their identity thrust upon us, and then there's moments and times where we hold our own identity, right? When it comes to our sexuality, like when it comes to our class, things like this, there are ways in which society reflects upon us what we are as opposed to maybe what we would identify as, and we need to make sure that we're understanding that just because those identities may clash at times does not make the identity that a person chooses any less valid. And so we need to just kind of, I wanted to touch base on what that meant, right? Because there's a lot of different characteristics that are categories that were placed upon, that are placed upon us as we move throughout society every day, as other people are making interactions with us, as other people are engaging with what we embody. And as we talk about gender, right, we're going to continue to talk about the differences between what we see or what we imprint upon someone else and what someone else imprints upon for themselves or calls to for themselves. I also want to get into a couple of definitions when it comes to feminism, because we are going to see that word a lot in some of these readings. And I think there are some very common misconceptions about what feminism is. Feminism is the political and social movement and sets of actions and ideas that work towards the equalities of all genders and all sexes, right? Now, again, the feminist movement has moved to a more intersectional framework, has moved to a more broad framework that is working to deconstruct hierarchies and further outside of just gender, and more with having conversations about race, having conversations about class. They've always kind of done things about class, but really having better conversations about those intersections of what those hierarchies are. To be a feminist is someone who essentially embodies or wants the equal rights and equal opportunities and equal availability for all genders. There are fractions of feminism and fractions of the feminist movement that don't necessarily do this, right? That are very anti-trans individuals, that are very white dominant in their ideologies. These fractions of feminism do not reflect the more broad parts of society. On the same time, you're also going to have, in every movement, you're going to have very radical fractions that create a lot of violence, that possibly are very anti whatever it is they're opposing, right? Feminism as a whole is as we should understand it, is the idea that, again, all genders should be equal. These misconceptions that there's like this bra burning anti-men uber lesbian situation going on in feminism is an intentional is intentional in its way to try to circumvent any success it might be having in doing any kind of reformative action within legislation or otherwise, or within social society, because it has changed language, it's changed a lot of things as we move through society. Now, again, it has had its issues, which are brought up in multiple of these conversations and will be something that we talk about moving forward as we talk about theory in here. But I wanted to have a basic framework for what feminism is and what is a feminist, right? So a feminist is not just a woman. A feminist can be any human being that is fighting for or wants the equity between all categories of gender, okay? So again, we're going to define something real quick. Intersectionality is a big key part of the theory pieces that we're going to read, and you're going to keep seeing it. That word's just going to keep popping up. But I want you to have a solid grasp of this, because this is a framework that is this is the most common used framework when we come and we have gender research, especially within sociology or more broadly. And it's a term that, as we move through the world and we understand the social world, it is something that is vital to understanding how the world operates and how society then impacts the individual, right? So how that macro level is going to be experienced by at that individual level. Sorry, a long day. Okay, so intersectionality is the idea that we hold multiple identities in any given moment. And in any given moment, those identities are going to intersect and collide to form the perspective that we are, right? So in this moment, I am both an academic, I am someone with a master's degree, I am female, I am white. These things all intersect to how I experience my academic career, how I experience this moment as a professor as a whole, right? And there's other things that do that too, right? There's class, there's disability. I am also a disabled person. This impacts my ability to be in person with all of you, right? Geographic region. There are so many things, right? There's so many categories that we hold with us in any given moment. And in any given moment, those things intersect in ways that are different from someone who might hold some of those other categories the same as us. And so really this is being brought up when our gender classes and through multiples of these articles, in the sense that when we talk about equality for women, or we talk about equality for gender, for any given gender, right? Nothing is homogenous, right? So the way I experience being female or being a woman is going to be different than a woman of color. It's going to be different than a trans woman. It's going to be different than someone with a lower income or a higher income, right? Like it's with like, okay, I'm going to experience being a woman very differently than those who are fleeing in Afghanistan right now, right? There's a very different perspective on what it means to be a woman in any given culture and in any given society and in any given moment. I also am going to experience what it is to be woman or what it is to be me very differently depending on the role I'm taking, right? So when I am taking a role as mom, that forefront of being woman may come up in certain contexts. Like if I was breastfeeding, that's going to come up, right? But in other contexts where I'm parenting or doing whatever, it may not be as in the forefront, right? Woman may not be the category. The category is more authoritarian figure or human who's making me clean up, making the little kids clean up, right? So like we understand that this doesn't, like in any given moment, any one of these could be at the forefront or multiple could be at the forefront. And that's really how we need to understand intersectionality, is that all of these identities are held by an individual at any given moment. And based on the social context for which it's operating, any one of those are going to make that experience very different than maybe someone else or someone with very similar characteristics or identities. Okay. And really, this gender through an intersectionality perspective is really talking about that, right? It's talking about the difference between understanding gender as different as, right, like this, I am different because I'm woman versus I am different because I'm male or man. Like, right, we homogenized these two groups when we started really working on equality for women or equality between the genders. We really homogenized them. We stuck in that binary, and that's all we did. What they are looking at is understanding that that homogenization really undercut women of color. It undercut women of different religions. It undercut women in a very, very realistic ways. And it also dominated white, middle class, straight women as their issues came to the forefront and were the ones that were centered and the ones that were chosen to matter within certain movement characteristics or within certain movement groups and the most broad-based movement groups. And this is why women of color and things and women of other religions, women, lesbian women, went off and kind of did their own fractions and their own kind of movement things to do their own rights in a different way. And what we want to do is create a feminism, and we're working towards that. And I think that's happening a lot more, that understands this intersectionality. This understands that we can't not talk about race. We can't not talk about sexuality. We can't not talk about class when we're talking about the things we're striving for these women, right? Or when we're striving for these things for men. In the same way, homogenizing the class of men, which we'll talk about in another one of the articles, really stuck with this hegemonic structure, this one idea of man being the only one that really was working. And what that happened was then you had gay men, you had Black men, you had all these other all these other identities colliding with men in ways that doesn't necessarily fit that hegemonic structure and didn't allow them the space to be able to have those masculinities as prominent, as real, as valid, right? And so we're going to talk about that when we get to the masculinities section. But I really want to touch on a couple of other things. She also talks about structural intersectionality. So this, which is really what we're talking about now, but we're also talking about political intersectionality. Every single one of these identities that we might carry, right, has its place in this social hierarchy, this social norms that we already do, and gets a certain level of sanctions, right? And what she's saying about this is that these political intersections allow you to maybe grasp opportunities here or maybe lose opportunities in other places, right? So I am a woman, but I'm a white woman. So I might have more especially economic opportunities or political opportunities that maybe a person of color or a woman of color may not have, right? Or I'm a queer woman. So as a queer woman, if I'm in a very heteronormative space or a very religious space, I'm going to not necessarily be seen in the same light as possibly those religious leaders or what have you, right? So we pick and have these identities that create opportunities in any given space, but there might be a through line with one identity that doesn't necessarily account for where we are on that hierarchical structure without those other identities. By making sense of this. If you have questions, again, ask, because this is a very important framework for how we're going to understand the world. So again, we talked a lot about how these kind of intersects, why these intersections are important, because again, those opportunities versus where you can call on maybe some of your other things, or call on my whiteness, or call on some of my other categories where I may not be able to do something so in other spaces. And again, I want to talk more importantly, again, we've done this a lot, but I want to reinforce that how does this identity intersect with society? So just because I hold all of these identities, and just because all of these identities might not be placed in this hierarchical structure in the ways that we want them to be, how do they how are they impacted? How does society impact that? How does shifts in society, how does shifts in language, how does shifts in the spaces I'm in? Because they're very, we create resilient spaces for within certain maybe peer groups, or maybe if you're queer, you have a queer group that you end up in, or the Alphabet Center or something like that, where in that space that queerness is a positive, right? Or if you're a person of color and you are in maybe a historically Black university, attending a conference. That is going to put you in a very different place. And it's in that space allows you to hold that identity in a different light, right? So understanding that context and society is going to place all of those identities in different ways and impact us in different. And so I'm hoping you're understanding intersectionality in a little bit better of a way, because I really wanted to give light to some of these definitions, because again, you're going to be hearing me say them a lot through the rest of these readings. All right, so if you have any questions, please reach out. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I will get back to you with some of the other lectures. Thank you so much.